Everybody, and welcome back. We've got Michael Brown from Vicarious PR here today for what I have deemed our most uplifting talk of the next 2 days. You can you can make no errors and still fail. Uh, this is going to be your primer into marketing your indie games. And so, if you've got questions, pop them in chat. We'll get to them. Michael, let's start. I mean, God, there's like so many different places we can start. What's the trend? Let's start with trends. What is going on? What is hot? What is not? How are people getting their games noticed right now?
There's a bunch of stuff. What's interesting when you look at, particularly in the PC market, you tend to find outside of the normal outliers in every genre, because even saturated genres have, your crazy outliers that do massively well. You tend to find that right now the most successful games are games that kind of meet a certain criteria, whether it's either in the spin on the genre that they're taking in, so maybe it's an underserved market that with very few games, or it's doing something innovative in some fashion or unique in some fashion within a genre. But there's really marketing's changing on a fairly consistent basis. And what we've seen recently is now it's no longer enough just to, first of all, just to make a game. That is not, even if you make a great game, that is not a necessary precursor to success, at least commercial success. On top of that, you have to now diversify your marketing. So what we've seen recently is games that do multi-channel marketing, and by multi-channel marketing I mean do very different, more than one different types of marketing, tend to succeed more consistently across the board versus games that will only choose maybe one channel of marketing. So particularly for indie games, this starts to become a challenge because obviously budgets are limited. And so when you don't have, AAA publisher size budgets, you've got to kind of pick and choose carefully. But what's very clear, at least based on, Steam metrics, sales data, traffic data, is that marketing now has to start earlier than ever before. And I don't mean just like, oh, let's start your marketing campaign 12 months out from launch instead of 6 months. I mean, you have to start thinking about marketing before pre-alpha. You have to basically mix and marinate marketing within the game design itself in order to make sure that the product is going to be commercially viable. So that's the biggest shift, because you've got on average dozens of games launching every day. It's as competitive as it's ever been. And then, you look at February this year in terms of if you're trying to get attention from the media, you had Warhammer 3, you had Elden Ring, you had another couple really big games and a couple of really big indie games. And that's just February. Like, it's a tough old place out there right now.
Oh, it's more than dozens a day. I get an email every Monday about what launched on Steam the previous week, and it's 200 to 300 games.
Yeah, I say dozens because I only consider dozens to be games that are actually worth a look. Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned, for companies that are doing multi-channel marketing, what are the channels? What are the key places that you should be marketing right now?
So the way that I now say to people to do things is to start at the very start of when you're conceptualizing your game and thinking about the first steps really are to look at your branding and your target audience. Because if you can figure those out correctly and you can figure out who your target audience for the game is, what your, in terms of your branding, so your logo, your screenshots, your core features of the game, how are they going to attract that target audience? That will help you, one, make a better game because you're making a game for people rather than just what you want. and then it will also influence your decisions in terms of later on, in terms of which marketing channels you choose. So, for example, if you're making a game that the average demographic of that game skews 35 to 45, then probably jumping on Instagram is not your best bet, right? You're gonna maybe want to go towards the more traditional routes of maybe going Facebook, print media, all that kind of thing. Whereas if you're making a game that's designed a 17-year-old, then obviously that's going to drastically change which social medias you spend time and focus on, which media you spend time and focus on, which influencers you spend time and focus on. So you really have to nail that down. And I often feel like one of the biggest mistakes a lot of indies make is they don't spend enough time in that process at the very start while they're making the game, because it really does have a massive impact and inform you about where you should be showing your game. Because there is no point in showing a game on, let's say, IGN if none of your target audience read IGN. It's an utter waste of time, effort, and sometimes money. So that for me is the core of every decision that comes after. And then you can choose, well, do I want YouTubers? Do I want Twitch streamers? Do I want social media? Do I want video content? Do I want image content? Do I want print media? Do I want ads? Do I want all these type of different things? All that has to be based on real metrics and real insight into who you're trying to sell to. Because, like any other industry in the world, you're trying to sell something to somebody. So you better know who you're trying to sell it to, because if you don't, then it's going to be ethereal and no one's ever going to see it.
All right. So how do you, if we're starting there at the very beginning and, in pre-production or wherever, we start, how do you figure out your target audience?
So there's a couple of different ways. So, spending a hell of a lot of time on Google and doing a lot of research always helps. Obviously, if you've got in-house marketing or a consultant, go talk to a consultant. Even just on, just spending a couple of hours talking to someone about, who, trying to segment that audience down, figure out what types of players play each game, look at reviews, look at similar games, look at the type of people that play those. There's a ton of sites like Newzoo and stuff like that have great audience segments, and they break down people by demographic and personality and psychographics. And for those of you who don't know what psychographics are, that's essentially behaviors that like a certain set type of person will do. So the way that we do it at Vicarious is that we break down a game's audience by different segments of the audience, and we'll do demographics, and then we make personas as a little game. So we'll be like, Dave is 35, 2 kids, full-time job, got a wife at home, has maybe 3 hours to play video games per week, very picky, very limited disposable income, probably only going to pick 1 to 2 games per month, if that. So that you're not gonna, Dave's not gonna be able to jump into a 60-hour game. So what appeals to Dave? What is it that appeals to Dave? Well, Dave probably likes games like Call of Duty that he can jump in and out of, feel a sense of progression, and not have to devote large periods of time because he's probably got to stop and start to pick the baby up and feed the baby and stuff like that, right? And so we do like this whole thing where we try and figure out, what people are looking for, and then we basically craft marketing messaging for each specific audience segment. And then that way, when I do a social media post, I'm literally doing that post for Dave, or I'm doing it for Susan, and I'm creating specific pieces of content in order to attract those people specifically. And that way I can really diversify the marketing, but also who you're talking to, and it makes it easier to think about what types of content to do. Because one of the biggest things I always hear is like, I don't know what to do, right? Well, if you know exactly who you're talking to and you know what appeals to them, then it makes that whole decision really easy.
I'm so glad you got into marketing personas, because it is important. And yes, sometimes it can be fun. Just think of it as you're building Sims, and the sim in this house does this, the sim in that house and does that. And so, like you said, we're going to market, to Dave and to Susan, but to hell with Rick. Rick's a dickhead. We're not going to market to him. It's one of those things. You can absolutely, if you want to get my attention as, a consultant or a scout in your pitch deck, have a couple of marketing personas in it, because at that point I'm like, holy shit, even if it's wrong, at least they have thought about this sort of stuff and they have a direction to go in. All right. So before we get into my next question, we've got one from Martha here on YouTube. For console games, it is more difficult to have accurate player data and metrics. Do you have any tips for those who make console games?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, and it is and it isn't. So what we tend to do is we take any data that we do have, and then we try and essentially use an educated guess based on that. And part of marketing is testing a hypothesis and then seeing if it works or not. So when we're running like any kind of ad campaign, maybe on social, for example, we'll test a couple of different creatives out based on target audiences, and then we'll kind of look at the data and see which perform better, which perform worse, and then we'll test different audiences out as well to see which responds better and which responds worse. Again, there's no perfect solution. Like, there's never going to be like this encyclopedia library of all the different types of gamers out there that you can kind of pick and choose and just go, there we go, I'll just pay $10 for that and I've got all the data I ever need. This is never going to happen, because because people's behaviors, people's likes, dislikes are constantly changing all the time. So you've just got to be able to adapt to that and make a good educated guess based on the data available. One of the things that you should think about, though, is console gamers, in terms of behaviors, look at what kind of games are successful on console. And you also have to remember that you can't generalize consoles as well. Like, a Nintendo player who plays Switch heavily and not really any other consoles is looking for something very, very different than a PS5 player, as well as an Xbox player. So you have to also consider that factor, and you have to come up with a couple of hypotheses and like, okay, well, these are the type of people that I think, based on the available data that I have, and then put that into practice, right? And then you can also look at, even go as far as you can do a survey, right? You can go online, create a survey real easy, try and share it around as many people as possible, and try and collect your own data as well and look at insights into that. So there's a ton of different ways that you can go about collecting data and metrics, but some of it does come down to just kind of try again until you kind of nail it. This is why it's really important when we do any kind of marketing, is to have a little buffer zone right at the start where you can kind of test a couple of different ads out, you can test a couple of different messaging out, and see which works really, which works the best, and then you're able to then scale that in a bigger way. But really, try and do the exercise of putting yourself into other people's shoes, and think about their lives and think about what their concerns are, what their limitations are. Do they have disposable income? Do they have time limitations? Do they have, what is it about them that they enjoy playing? So, and what kind of experience are they looking for as well, right? Because take something like Elden Ring, right? Elden Ring is a really relevant, and just to be relevant, and a perfect example of this. So you've got a bunch of different types of player in Elden Ring that you never had in a Dark Souls game before. So what you have is you've got the core Dark Souls fans who are there for the boss battles and the challenge. But now with this open world and this exploration and this kind of ethereal, weird world that's got a mystery behind it, you also have players going in because they want to explore and they want to look around and they want, that kind of Breath of the Wild experience almost, where they can travel this world and find cool things. And so you also have to factor those things in, because, you can have a bunch of different players playing the same game, all looking and excited by different aspects of that game. Bethesda games are great examples of this too. Like, two people can play Skyrim for totally different reasons and like different things about the same game, because it offers a variety of different experiences. So definitely do some testing, figure out what you think your audience is going to like, try and test that out, put it into practice, and then change based on the feedback.
Yes, I agree. Two people can play Skyrim and have completely different experiences, but we all know damn well they're all going to end up being stealth archers at the end of the day.
Oh, terrible.
Yes, without heavily modding it. Yes. Anyway, all right. So one of the points that you touched on there was with the ads, and I have my wonderful intern Cameron is digging this link up for me. If you need a primer on how to do these ads, we actually had Chris Failer a couple of conferences ago give a whole talk where he sat down and did a walkthrough on how to do it. And so as soon as Cameron can get that to me, I will pop it over. All right. So the title of the whole talk here, how is it that you can do everything right and still fail?
Unfortunately, it's just the reality of life in general for the most part. I mean, look, we've all seen games that from a mechanical, does the game work, is it good standpoint, works really well. They marketed heavily and no one bought it. It was a commercial failure. I mean, we've all seen those games. Square Enix have had many games that have been commercial failures, regardless of how much money they pumped into it. EA has had games that have failed, money put into it, and then you get games that seemingly come out of nowhere. Valheim is a perfect example of this, right? Like Valheim blew up with very little marketing compared to that of a AAA title. And so, sometimes the marketplace does decide. I think there are ultimately, the reality is while most people and most studios, regardless of experience and budget, inherently will make mistakes in some form in their marketing one way or the other, or within the game some way or the other, because there's never a perfect game and there's never a perfect marketing campaign 100%. There is always the chance that the game just does not resonate with its audience or with its intended audience. The game, and it might be due to, it might be due to that there's a competitor out there that's more fun. I mean, a great game, Cliffy B's game. I forget the name. That first person
Breakers.
Yeah. It's not Gravity Breakers. It was something like that, though, wasn't it? But it was the one with the zero G combat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was objectively a super fun game, but flopped miserably. And people didn't care about it. And you could look at that and say, well, how did, if you looked at that from like a marketing standpoint, you're like, how did that fail? Because the game was good mechanically, and in terms of marketing, I mean, that game was covered everywhere. I mean, all the top media covered it. It had ads, it had banner ads running, it had influencers playing it, it had, Twitch ads going on, it was all over social media. And yet, by 2 weeks in, nobody cared about it anymore. And it's perfectly viable for that to happen. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, it doesn't happen regularly for most people. But, you have to be aware of the fact that that is a very real possibility. So in order to avoid that possibility, you have to take as many steps as you can, given time, resources, and availability, to make sure that your game really does. Lawbreakers, there you go. Gravity Breakers.
Thank you, Chase.
But yeah, so you've got to really make sure that you can try and make the game appealing as possible to your audience, and make sure that it is something that people are hungry for. And I think one of the things that a lot of game makers don't consider when first starting a game, they'll think to themselves in their little developer bubble, they'll go, oh, I really like puzzle platformers, so I'm going to make a puzzle platformer. But the problem is there's nobody crying out for another puzzle platformer, right? Because it's an oversaturated market. And there are many games that do fail through really no fault of their own, other than it was the wrong genre at the wrong time. It's the equivalent of making a zombie game right at the tail end of the zombie, the big zombie trend that went on a couple of years back. And then suddenly people are like, well, why did that fail? I made a perfectly good zombie game. And it's like, because people have been playing zombie games for 4 years straight. and they want something different now. Like that's
we have killed all the fucking zombies. All right,
and it's like and yes, there there, and it goes in circles and it goes in waves, and you have a situation where CRPGs aren't popular, and then they have a massive resurgence, and then suddenly they are popular again, and then they kind of taper off, and then a couple of years later they'll pick back up again. And there's always those cycles and waves of popularity within all different types of genres. But if your fundamental product is I want to make a game in this genre because I like that genre, but you're not prepared to innovate or at least try and make it unique enough to stand out from the crowd, then it doesn't necessarily matter how good mechanically the game is and how good the marketing is. It's likely that you might face audience fatigue, and that's going to be a killer for the game straight away. So all of those factors come in, and there's a bunch of different reasons why many different types of games fail. But the reality is that it is always a possibility, and considering the amount of games launching every day, the amount of amazing companies and newcomers who are making really good games, and the sheer amount of competition and competition for people's attention in general, it's as tough as ever to make a commercially successful product. And so it really comes down to trying to make a game as commercially viable as possible from the get-go right up until launch, and making sure that you can really stand out and appeal to your audience and get them excited. Because if the audience looks at something and doesn't feel anything, then you fundamentally failed in both game design and marketing. If the player does not get excited by at least one aspect of that game by looking at it, that you're in hot water already.
All right, so let's jump back to something that you and I were talking about before the whole world joined us. What about the situations where you can do a great game? Because it's like Lawbreakers on paper. If you've taken that and went to, and they did do this because they got a shit ton of money from Tencent or somebody to make the game. Yep. On paper, Cliff Bleszinski's making a multiplayer shooter in the battle royale realm. That's a no-brainer. That publishers and investors are going to fund that almost immediately. Another one that I'll bring up is like Phoenix Point. So Phoenix Point came out on paper. Julian Gallup, and I worked with Julian years and years ago on Laser Squad Nemesis, and Julian and his brother were the ones that did the original XCOM. No one knows that gameplay better than Julian.
Yep.
But that game, I think it did well enough to recoup, but it didn't completely blow through everything.
Yep.
You have to look out for, because Michael and I were talking about XCOM 2 and Long War of the Chosen, the mod that comes out. If you've got a genre that, even if it's not hyper competitive, because I would argue that the tactical turn-based strategy genre is not over-flooded. God knows I would love for there to be more of them. If there's something that stands out there that is still like the cream of the crop, and you can't fundamentally improve on it, no matter how good your game is, people are still going to just keep playing XCOM.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the potential for that in some degree, but I would argue that, for example, I mean, I love Phoenix Point, but when you compare the two between XCOM 2 and Phoenix Point, if I asked you to think of what's an iconic image from XCOM 2, what's an iconic enemy, you're in your mind, you're easily able to picture it. Yeah. If I tell you to imagine an iconic enemy from Phoenix Point, I bet you can't. Okay. And the same goes with Lawbreakers, right? So if I said, imagine a character from Overwatch, you can imagine several. If I said to you, imagine a character from Lawbreakers, you ain't going to be able to.
Well, I mean, but now we're through 2-3 years past it. It's that's, but I mean, it is.
Yeah, but the same principle applies, because I haven't played Overwatch since launch, but I can tell you what the majority of their characters look like, and I can tell you what their logo looks like, and I can tell you what the color palette is. And I haven't played a Blizzard game in a long time. but I couldn't. But what I remember of Lawbreakers is it looked very Unreal Engine like, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, there are inherent failures in the marketing as well as the branding that don't make it memorable, right? Because if you don't make something memorable, then you're gonna forget, and it's just the way it is, right? And
the very definition of memorable.
Pretty much. But it's like anything else. There are elements of games that are ultimately difficult to replicate and difficult to conceptualize or ensure, because you can make a mechanically perfect game and that game still not be fun, right? Like, you can, from a game design perspective, you can create something and it will objectively be not fun. Now, can you explain the reason why it's not fun? Most people probably can't, right? They'll just say to you it's not fun. Whereas you can create a simultaneously different game in the same genre with relatively the same mechanics, and people go away, that was really fun. Now, it's a kind of odd concept in games, but there is a certain degree of fun factor with games, right? If a game, with that, it's the whole, whether you call it retention, whether you call it stickiness, whether you call it the fun factor, whatever, there is an element to it that every component, art, sound, game mechanics, gameplay loop, etc., all have to kind of conjoin together to create something that is memorable and is fun, and you leave away wanting more. And again, like I'm talking about Elden Ring because I keep playing it. Elden Ring grabbed me massively when it came out, but I hate Dark Souls games. I hate them, like, absolutely. Like, I do. I remember playing Dark Souls 1, and I bought it at launch for whatever, $60 or whatever, and I played 20 minutes of it. I went, this game is definitely not for me. I hate it. I can't even get past the first skeletons. I'm done. This is terrible design. I'm out, right? And for some reason, I absolutely love Elden Ring, right? And is that the changing world? Is it the changing design? Is it the fact that it's open world, or is it the fact it's a combination of those things plus the Dark Souls combat that has suddenly made that fun for me? Now, I couldn't nail down one thing over the other, but for whatever reason, Elden Ring is ridiculously fun, whereas Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, I hate them to the core of my being. So, there is always that element where you need everything to kind of work together to form that player experience. And it can be it's kind of art mixed with science a little bit, because it is a difficult thing to execute on.
It's very difficult, and through the work that we do on the consulting side, we get frequently called into developers and publishers to look at their gameplay mechanics and how a game's coming along, and is it going to be successful, and all of this sort of stuff. And the biggest blocker that we have with developers are if the leadership of the company comes from another industry, and they were an engineer, and it's like, well, we know how to code, so, we're just gonna make it. They don't always grasp that it has to be fun, and you can't make it fun into a Kanban board or a Scrum. It doesn't fit. You just have to go back and make it fun, and it's not something you can quantify. I mean, I'll agree. So I grew up as a PC gamer. I didn't have a console growing up. My first console was after I got in the industry, and it was a PlayStation. But I had never played a Zelda game ever until Breath of the Wild came out. And I absolutely loved it. And I have a very good friend who has told me for 20 years I should not be allowed to even work in the industry because I had never played a Zelda game. And he hated it, absolutely hated Breath of the Wild, because it was that open world. It wasn't the usual thing that Zelda games do. Go here, get this key, clear this dungeon, go to the next one, and go to the next one. And so, yeah, it could very well be that whole open world part of it, but it's one of those things that it's hard to pin down.
It is, and it's often, and I think the reason it's hard to pin down is often because it's often a combination of different elements working together to create something unique. And the reason I talk about it so much in terms of marketing is because marketing is a direct multiplier of the quality of a game. So if you've got a great game, then you add marketing to that, and it will perform well 9 times out of 10. But you can't have good marketing period with a bad game. You just can't. It's never going to do anything. And so you have, marketing has to start really on the design page, because you have to think about what are the features that are going to appeal to players when I tell them about it. What are the things, and it's like when you're trying to come up with that fun factor, it's little things as well. Like it's even small things like animations and just small things that like you wouldn't consider, especially in, like, for example, turn-based tactics games. I often find that I enjoy games that have really good combat animations much more than static sprites, right? Because if someone's put the time and effort to put a variety of combat animations, how a guy swings a sword or how a guy shoots a gun, or how a guy dies and falls over, then I find that much more immersive and therefore much more enjoyable versus a game where they do the same attack over and over and it's the same animation and it feels very repetitive and kind of rigid in terms of its execution visually. And so if you take that and scale it across all the disciplines across a game, it adds up to something, right? And that usually comes into a well-executed, fun experience. And then you can use that in your marketing, and good marketers will take all of those little elements and make content and marketing materials out of that ends up with people absolutely falling in love with it and flocking to it wildly.
All right, so let's switch gears here. Steam Next Fest over the last year and a half has become like a huge thing, to the point that I would argue too huge. You've got hundreds of some games out there. They only leave them up for a week, and every indie team in the world is competing for that space.
Yep.
How do you make your game stand out and start, if wish list is your objective,
yep,
how do you not just become, it was another platformer on Steam Next Fest? I mean, what do you do to get people to play your game in the course of that 1 week versus the other 200 that are up there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, as someone who's had mini games on the Next Fest over the past 2 years, and a lot of my clients have seen like a really lot of success on the Next Fest. I mean, I love it. I love the Next Fest. I think the biggest draw from, you've got to put yourself in the mind of an average Steam user, right? So you've got to assume that nobody knows shit about your game, hands down. And so the first thing that they're going to see, more than likely, if you're in the Next Fest, is the capsule, right? So you've got to make sure that capsule, from a logo and background perspective, is interesting enough for people to go, oh, what is that, right? What is that? Because that's your first hook, right? So you've piqued their interest, and you don't have long to do that. You've probably got maybe like 3 seconds, 4 seconds at most for someone to browse through Steam page and go, oh, what's that? That looks interesting. So if you can nail that down, then you get to the second part, which is your key visuals, right? Because I couldn't tell you how many times I know for a fact that people don't read the text that you put on Steam. Some do, right? But the amount of times that I've had to respond to people's questions about a game when I'm just like, it literally says the answer to your question on the front page of the Steam, if you'd have just read the question, read the page. So they don't. But what people do look at is the trailer and the key visuals, right? And this is why it is super important to spend a ton of time picking screenshots out very, very carefully, because it will determine whether someone hits wishlist or not. I know we've done surveys in our company where I know for a fact that there are a great many number of players out there who will wishlist based on visuals alone. And that's it. Just visual, and I'm not a big believer in graphics is everything, because it isn't. Ultimately, you still have to have a good game and everything like that. But in terms of just that initial hook of grabbing that person for the wish list, really it's the first impression of your game ultimately, and and you know, a lot of times it will be the deciding factor if someone wishlists the game or not. And so you have to really consider, what are the screenshots that are on the page? Do they look good? Are they representative? Do they show the best features of our game, the most unique features? Do they show them in a good way? Is our game going to be, consider the fact, is my game going to be tough to make good screenshots for? Because there's some games that are. Like, there are some games that are very, very vibrant color-wise and very, very noisy on screen. And when you play it, it's totally fine. But if you take a screenshot of it, you look at it and go, what the hell is going on there?
Yeah.
Right? And so you have to solve that problem, because it's going to make a big difference. Your trailer, what's that trailer going to look like? Is it just going to be, because really, when someone watches the trailer, you've got maybe 10 seconds. So maybe don't put your logo first.
Yes,
that's probably a really good idea. Don't make a 20-second long intro where it's just black screen with logos popping up. Maybe leave that to the end and put your game first, and put like a really interesting either cutscene or a bit of gameplay where it jumps right into the action. Put that first, and so you've got to consider these things. It's difficult. You don't have long to capture these people's attention. Right, and so you have to this is why, and again, this is why there's a lot of games out there that the first several hours of the game is fantastic, and then it feels like the second half of the game is basically empty, right? And the reason for that is because a lot of game designers know that people probably won't pass that 8-10 hour mark in their game, and so they make the game really good at the start so that they leave a positive review. And then everybody else, will deal with it as they deal with it. And I've played many, many RPGs that are fantastic for like the first half of the game, and then suddenly you're in this world and there's nothing in it. There's no content in it apart from the main quest. And so, you have to think about, first impressions are everything when it comes to Steam. And that, if you're in a Next Fest, ultimately that is going to be the deciding factor, is your visuals, because no one will spend the time looking at it. And there obviously you can do your live streams and things like that, and get influencers involved with your live streams always helps massively, drive a lot of traffic and attention. But ultimately, if you can't capture that person's and pique that person's interest off the capsule alone, you're already going to be struggling a little bit there. But if you don't have good screenshots and a good trailer, then it's going to be a real challenge to convert that initial traffic into wish lists in any form.
All right, I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to dive away for a second because my four-legged friend here has just woke up from her nap and she wants to go outside and play in the rain. So one, how important is it to have those either influencers or the just yourself doing the streaming on Next Fest? And is it okay should you be streaming as much as possible live the entire time, or is it okay to stream and then recycle that review?
You could do both. I think it's important to definitely do a stream, and I think actually I always recommend people do any kind of developer live stream fairly regularly, even outside of the Next Fest, because it's a great way to interact with your audience, and it also sends a very positive impression to potential customers of like, hey, this developer really does care about their game and they're interested in talking to the community and showcasing what they've got to offer and what they're working on. You can also get influencers, and influencers can be great. It really just depends on, like, you've got to make sure that they're targeted influencers. Don't just pull anyone left, right, and center in. Make sure that you're picking someone who's actually, obviously, one, interested in the game and willing to play it, but two, they either have the target audience that you're trying to reach, or that they're very experienced in the genre, and so they know exactly what they're talking about, so they can represent the game well. Because there's nothing worse than getting an influencer to live stream a game and they either didn't do any research, don't know anything about the genre, or don't know anything about the game, because it just comes across as really poor, because it's really poor for them, and it really it doesn't leave a nice impression about the game either, because then they're misrepresenting mechanics and putting themselves in a situation where they're talking false information about the game. But yeah, definitely, I always recommend trying to live stream as much as possible. It's also certainly okay to recycle content sometimes. Like, we often will, for some of our games that we promote, we will have either a developer live stream and then maybe like 3 or 4 different influencers do separate live streams on the Steam page, and then we'll take all that content and put it into like a long stream, and then we'll restream that like throughout the week. And it's a really great way of showcasing the game, and I think it can really help on that visual aspect as well, because it allows people outside of the trailer and the screenshots to, the first thing they see is going to be the big video, and especially if your game streams well, it's a great visual tool to be able to capture someone's attention and then inherently a wish list as well. So I think that's a pretty big, it's a pretty big win across the board to be able to do that.
All right, and so just to rewind for folks who may not understand what that capsule is, what we're talking about is that what we used to call cover art. It's that big.
Yeah, it's the head. It's the header capsule on the top right of the top right of your Steam page.
And so that advice is not only good for marketing to Steam, but it's also extremely important when you're pitching to publishers as well, because I have sat in on many a greenlight meeting where a game was kicked because, like you said, it's you look at it and it's just like too busy, and it's like I don't even know what the hell's going on the screen, and you lose them, because you will lose a publisher just as quickly. I mean, we had our panel this morning. Johan from Raw Fury said they're looking at 1,500 games a year.
Mm-hmm.
How much depth do you think that first pass goes in when you're looking at 1,500 games a year coming in? So I mean, look, everybody does it. Everybody does a visual check. It's the first check that you do, because people, people's attention spans and the way people work now, it's more about, okay, I'm going to do this first visual check to see if I should dedicate my time enough to learn more, right? And so if you don't pass that visual check, it's over. I mean, it's one and done. And you have to also consider the fact that it's, don't look at your Steam capsule as like, oh, this is what it looks like when it's on my page, when it's bigger, right? You have to consider it when it's in the up and coming small section, right? What does it look like there? Is it readable? Can people see what it is? I mean, I've literally had many indie clients come to us and they're like, hey, can you critique our Steam page? And I rip the whole thing out and rebuild it from the scratch up, because I'm just like, I can't read that. I can't even see it. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it represents. Like, your game is called this, and I don't even know what that alludes to. Like, it's just, I mean, I remember one developer I had, God bless them, they had orange on yellow. And that's like Borderlands, though.
Right, but it wasn't, there was no line art. It was just orange and yellow. Oh. So it was yellow with orange on top. And so when you looked at it in the small capsule, it just blended. It looked like a Picasso painting. You couldn't see anything. Like, it was just rough. And so, you like, all of those things are very, very important to do, because, it really does define very quickly. And I've seen, we do a standard of Vicarious. Like, when a client comes on with us, we will like redesign their Steam page from the ground up. And oftentimes we will see, particularly indies are probably the biggest, the biggest, more consistent growth scale on this. We've seen indie clients go from like 40 to 50 or less wish lists a day, and then after we've redone their capsule and Steam page, they jump to like a couple hundred a day. And that's game discovery. Like, that's how important it is. You could be sitting out there right now with a great game and be losing 100 or more wish lists a day because you have bad visual presentation on your Steam page.
All right, so that's a good segue into wish list. What is a good number? What are the metrics that you should be targeting?
What is a good number?
You can't give the same answer that they gave this morning, Michael. That's just cheating,
What was the answer they gave this morning?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, well, that's not true. It does matter.
Well, all right. So the point this morning was, a wish list that was activated a year before
Yes.
release is not going to correlate as well as a wish list that was made, the day of release or 2 days before. And now, we all know that no one's actually going to buy it until it's that 90% off sale. But that's beside the point. We get this a lot from developers. Is there like a magic number of wish lists that they should be shooting for in total, or
yeah?
by
I
day?
mean, so this, I mean, it kind of varies from genre to genre. I understand what there is certain degree of drop off rate in terms of like a year old wish list will not convert as well as a 2 week old wish list. That said, though, I would also argue that that doesn't take into account the quality of wish lists as well. Like if you've done 2 years of very targeted marketing, that's very, very different than like broad scale marketing where the wish lists are coming from anywhere and everywhere. Because if you've got 2 years solid targeted marketing, I would argue that the likelihood of those year-old wish lists converting is probably at a much higher rate than something that's more broad and generic. But outside of that, wish lists. So wish lists can be good for two things. One is obviously generating a rough forecast of revenue, but the second is if you can generate, and I would argue anywhere between 30 to 50,000 wish lists, give or take, that would pretty much guarantee you a front page placement on Steam on launch. And I don't mean like the big header placement. I mean you'd be in the new and trending, and because you're likely to be showcased a lot more, and it will definitely get you to the upcoming, right? Like the week before your launch, it will get you to the top of the upcoming list, which, as you guys know, will massively exponentially increase the eyeballs on the product, right? And so that's going to do two things. One is it's going to massively increase the eyeballs, and obviously, if assuming that you've got good capsule art and good key art and everything like that, that's going to dramatically boost your wish lists right before launch, which is only going to lead to a positive net result in terms of conversions. But also, it means that there is a good likelihood that when your game launches, Steam will send out a wishlist notification saying that your game was launched. So that's a nice little direct messaging a newsletter for you without you having to actually do anything. But it does make, the higher a game is wishlisted, the more people tend to pay attention, and it's the same principle as like rolling a snowball down a mountain, or once you hit a certain exponential amount of people who are interested in the game, Steam's algorithm is going to reward you for that inherently, because Steam's algorithm sitting there going, well, this game has a ton of wish lists, which means people like it, which means more people need to see it so that they like it also, and then we can sell more copies of it and we can get more money. That's basically, that is essentially how the Steam algorithm works at its core. So I would aim as an indie for a minimum of about 25,000 wish lists. I've seen games perform well and get Steam front page upcoming and stuff like that at around 19,000, 18,000 at a minimum. But it really does depend on your launch week, because if you're launching on a week where you've got 5-6 other games that have got tens of thousands of wish lists, then it's going to be a bit more difficult. But I would aim for around that number, because then you're ensuring. I know ideally you'd have a lot more wish lists depending on the genre, and it depends on the audience and things like that, and there's a couple of variables within there. But if you can get to that number, then you can kind of not sit comfortably, but there is a much more bigger chance that you'll be on the front page.
All right, so I completely skipped Maria's question here. For short games, it's difficult for PC games. Is there a specific time or a type of marketing to do to release shorter games?
Yes. Depends on what type of game it is in terms of shortness. So I would avoid, I usually say 3 to 6 months marketing for a short game. I would avoid influencers until post-launch. Influencers, particularly, you can have influencers play the game, but I would be very picky and choosy about what type of content they produce. Don't let anybody do Let's Plays of a short game, because Let's Plays, especially if it's a story-driven game, it's going to ruin the entire thing, and people are going to watch this big influencer play it, and then they're not going to buy it because they've seen, all 3 hours of the game. I would stick to video content marketing, so putting short form video clips out on things like TikTok, making development diaries, making fun little short clips for across your social media channels, doing social, video ads, that kind of thing. And then, it might be worth, depending on your budget, doing some content with influencers that's sponsored that isn't Let's Plays. So you could do like a thematic video where the game is being showcased, but not much of it, and it's like more skit show or animated or talking about the theme or topics or whatever of the game. Like recently, I did a project with the National Peanut Board, where they were trying to reach a younger gaming centric audience to talk about the health benefits of peanuts, which sounds horrifically boring, I know. And so, and they literally wanted to get a bunch of gaming influencers to stand in front of a camera and be like, here are the health benefits of peanuts. And it's like, and I heard that pitch and I was like, you're trying to bore me to tears here. And so what we ended up doing is we actually worked with Smosh Games for this, and we got Smosh to come down to Georgia and actually go to a peanut farm, and we filmed them for like 2 days, these pasty kids doing an actual day's labor on a farm. And at the end of it, we had them take the farmer, who was a lovely young woman. They had and played Stardew Valley and did virtual farming and had the farmer comment on like what it's like to farm in a video game. And then we edited it all together and made it really entertaining, light and funny. And it got like 500,000 views in like 2 days. And it still contained the message, but was actually entertaining.
Wait, where? I want to see this. Where is this?
It's on the Smosh Games channel. I'll send you a link.
All right. We've only got like 5 more minutes. I love it. You and I can get on here and just like go for a while.
We can talk for hours.
We're going to keep going until Dan tells me we're ready. So for those of you who are watching who want to know more about influencer marketing, that's exactly what we're doing with a panel next. So just stick with us for 10 minutes. John's got a question. Where do most wish lists months before launch come from? Organic Steam traffic or external like YouTube videos?
It can be a variety. I mean, I did a blog post recently showing some of the case studies that we'd done at Vicarious. So we've had, massive wish list spikes from articles. So we got a piece in PC Gamer and Kotaku for a client, for example. And those articles launched separately on different weeks, and they had massive spikes. I mean, you're talking like they went from like 200 a day to, I think though each day had like something like 6,000 to 10,000 wish lists. Vice versa, we've had we have had games where they've got big traffic in the media and got nothing from it in terms of traffic as well. Influencers can drive a lot of traffic. Ads can drive traffic. It can also come organically. I mean, depending on how well your visual presentation is and where it's showing up on Steam and things like that. The majority of your day-to-day wish list, when you're not actively doing something in terms of like outreaching to press or getting media coverage or getting influencer coverage, is going to come organically from Steam. More than likely, it's going to be coming from either people browsing genre-specific up-and-coming lists, or it's going to be Steam Discovery or whatever it may be. But yeah, there's a variety of different ways, different sources, and obviously, we always try to track that as best we can, given the limitations of our beloved Valve's platform.
All right, so so we had the question earlier, but yes, we can find PC game data for for what we can get. Mm-hmm. Consoles are a little harder. Where do you go when you start building, either your marketing personas or your competitive analysis for a mobile game? Where do you go to find out what's coming out? Because it's like Google and Apple don't have early access stores. Mm-hmm. So how do you anticipate what you're going to be competing against?
There's a lot of, yeah, I mean, in terms of upcoming competitive stuff, it's difficult. There are a couple of sites that kind of showcase, there are a couple of sites out there that showcase games that are in like active beta, for example, or doing soft launches around the world in different places. So you can kind of get an idea of what's coming out, but there's no crystal clear crystal ball of telling you what mobile launches are coming up. Mobile, though, is a little bit easier to do because the audience is so wide. Well, it's a little bit easy to do, but simultaneously harder to do because the audience is so wide. But inevitably with mobile games, the I would say the advantage that mobile has over something like Steam and console is that it's native. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to access people via social media for mobile games versus a Steam game where they have to click off the social media and then open up Steam or go onto their computer and do that. Like there's less steps involved, so it's much easier to use paid advertising to your advantage in that sense than it is to do any other form of game right now. But yeah, I mean it's difficult to look at the competition, but like in terms of, I would say the best advice to that is to kind of build your audience personas, look at any data available on things like Newzoo that will tell you like a whole bunch of interesting stats and information on mobile gamers specifically, and then just build your strategy out from there. And because the marketplace for mobile games is so big, especially if you're making a free-to-play game, that the chances are you will be able to find the audience with that. And you also have to bear in mind that mobile games work slightly differently than something like a PC game. So you don't have a launch, launch isn't the be all and end all. You have a lot more success long term. So you can have a mobile game and you can promote it heavily post launch and it'll still be as good as it was at launch. You can kind of do bigger marketing pushes, whereas console games and PC games have this kind of relevancy feel, whereas like once it's past launch, it's no longer relevant anymore, so people just don't give a shit, which is kind of stupid, especially considering that more and more games are becoming more and more successful longer after the launch, like Among Us versus things like that. I mean, it's very backwards and two-dimensional thinking, really. But there you go. That's a run for another day.
All right, so thank you so much. And personally, Michael's team over at Vicarious handles all the PR for Indie Game Business. And one of the reasons is because you believed in what we were doing when this was my first, harebrained idea to get this done. And they have been with us through all 10 events. And I just, from my side and from our team, I sincerely appreciate putting up with our asses for 4 years and continuing to do this.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, I don't take compliments like that well because I'm British, so like it's just like we don't express feelings.
Just tell me to fuck off. It's all right. It's all good.
Fuck off. Don't express feelings.
All right, so we're gonna wrap this one. If you've got more questions, Michael and his entire team are on our Discord server. Pop over there, ask questions. We'll get them answered. I'm going to close this one, and Dan is going to be coming right back with influencer marketing panel from our friends at Lightspeed and other places too. Thanks, everybody.